Well, I think we're live now with all our sites. So my name is Christine Haney Douglas, and I work for the University of Nebraska Lincoln with the Environmental Studies program. And today we'd like to present Dr. David Gosselin speaking about water and everything connected to everything else. This is part of our Sustainability Leadership presentation series and brought to you by a partnership between Central Community College, the Gosselin Institute for Sustainable Communities, Metropolitan Community College, University of Nebraska Lincoln, and WasteCap Nebraska. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gosselin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainability Leadership Series. There's a variety of ways in which you can interact during this presentation. If you have questions and things, I believe you can send those in, and we'll take care of those at the end of the presentation. I'm starting off today with this little life as a journey, not a destination. I know that in this audience in front of me, I've got a lot of lifelong learners, and the approach I'm going to take in this presentation is to really just talk about a variety of things related to water, and both from a global standpoint down to some local things that we have going on in and around the Great Plains, I guess you could say. So this is the title of my talk today, and as the slide indicates, I wear a variety of hats. As Christine indicated, I'm the Director of Environmental Studies. I'm also Professor of Earth Science here at the School of Natural Resources at UNL. I'm also spent a lot of time coaching, which has influenced my kind of educational sort of philosophy. And I also have to put a shameless plug in for my book, which I completed here in October, called Focus on Them. So I have 4 take-home messages for you today. The first one has to do with the business of water literacy and improving your water literacy. And that's basically defined as knowing where your water comes from and how you use it, and the you being you as individuals and you as part of a community. The second take-home message is that there are many people and many different perspectives with regards to water issues. And you can summarize those in, related to science and technology. There's the political and legal aspects of water, as well as the economic aspects of water. And hopefully, as reasonable people, we can hopefully come to some sort of common ground in dealing with these water issues, that we show mutual respect for one another as we deal with these water-related issues. And hopefully we can agree to disagree at times and come to some sort of common understanding, or again, coming back to this common ground. The third take-home message will be that everything is connected to everything else. And not only do we have water issues in the context of these 3 components, but we also have water related to such things as global security. And this is a huge issue on a global scale, related back to the whole business of water scarcity. And that we are very, very fortunate here in Nebraska, in particular, to have access to a plentiful water supply. But as we'll see as we go through the talk, that doesn't necessarily exist in other parts of the country as well as other parts of the world. And then, of course, we have this thing called the water cycle, and the USGS has got this beautiful diagram that shows all the interrelationships of the physical and chemical and biological sorts of systems. But this water cycle ties us not only together in Nebraska in a local water system, but it also ties us globally to the world in terms of what may happen in terms of the distribution of water as we go into the future. And then this whole business of what we'll call sustainable use of water resources. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more. But basically, we want to be looking at how we can meet our current needs without necessarily impacting in a negative way what's going to happen in the future. And that's and this whole business of sustainability is, it says in this definition, a holistic approach, but really looking at water in the context of a system. And that actually humans are part of that system as well. So to start off with this whole business of sustainable use of water resources, we can use an analogy to our own personal capital and resources, right? We have income rates, and we have ways in which we expend that income, all right? And our ultimate goal, hopefully, is that our balance sheet will be that our income will be greater than our outcome, and that we'll actually gain assets, or at least maintain our assets, so we can use those now and into the future. But of course, as we know, many things impact our assets. And the same thing goes with regards to the water cycle in terms of impacting assets. So if we look at water assets, and those will be predominantly groundwater and surface, well, not be primarily, they are groundwater and surface water resources. In Nebraska, we are very well endowed with groundwater resources, as we know. I mean, I think with 97% of Nebraskans rely on groundwater for their personal drinking water supplies. Other places are more dominated by surface water sorts of resources. Both of these things are influenced by the rate in which the water is replaced as part of this natural water cycle, and also influenced by the rate at which we use those resources. So again, our hope is that if we maintain this balance between inputs and outputs, and then hopefully the inputs are going to exceed the rate at which we use it, or at least maintain it. Otherwise, we end up with having a debt in our bank account or in our water accounts, if you will be, and we can only sustain that for so long before that can become real problems. And we'll talk about that. So, in general, water resources are renewable as long as your replacement rate versus your usage rate your replacement rate is greater than your usage rate. But they can become non-renewable in some cases. And the High Plains Aquifer in Texas and other such locations, they are in a non-renewable situation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So, but again, what I'm talking about there is the relationship between the environmental component. Again, this input and output related to water. But there are also, again, a lot of other things that influence our access to water. And when we talk about this business of sustainability, we're not only talking about these environmental components, but we have these other things that also are involved, society and economics that go along with it. And so again, when we talk about this business of sustainability, some people, we sometimes get hung up on words, but it's really about the business of using our resources the most efficiently and effectively that we can. And that obviously involves a variety of other components besides just the physical system. And again, we want to be thinking about meeting needs now as well as into the future. So, the business of water literacy and global. We're gonna see a quick video here, and this actually comes from Leonardo DiCaprio, who has his own foundation, but he kind of put together this thing on the water cycle, and many of you might be familiar with some of these things, but it's a nice visual way to see how this water cycle and some of the global related issues. In terms of the challenges that we face, again, both locally and as on a global scale, we have competing demands, and we all know about these sorts of things between urban populations and agricultural sorts of concerns, as well as the natural systems that's related to wildlife, as an example. We have the business of ownership of water and who owns the water. And there's a movie I might hopefully show you a little clip of, and I'll do it my way on this side, is the business of the privatization of water, and also talking about this whole business of a bottled water industry and how that is having some interesting impacts at a variety of different scales. Looking at water scarcity, and not only for growing food, as we have issues here in Nebraska when we're talking about drought, but we're really talking about water scarcity for human consumption. And not only the scarcity, but also having quality water for people to drink as well. And then the whole business of conservation of water, in that there are a variety of different practices and technologies that can come to play in how we may meet these current and future challenges. And this all comes down to water security. And water security most oftentimes is looked upon as being something that may be between countries. It may be also between states, as we have here in Nebraska with regards to some of the relationships that we have had between Wyoming and Nebraska, and Nebraska and Kansas. Those could be considered security issues to some degree. So when we start talking about competing demands, we also need to think about, first of all, where water is used. Let's see if this will work. There we go. We start talking about water, and we look at where the water is that we can consume. There's only about 2.5% of water that is really used, or that can be used by humans. And this number will vary depending upon whose reference that you have. But it's bottom line here is it's a very small percentage of the total amount of water that's available as fresh water. The other thing about that fresh water is that a vast majority of it is locked up in glaciers, okay, that we don't necessarily have direct access to. And then, so the majority of that, the water that we consume as humans, either has to come from a surface water or groundwater source. Nebraska, again, we all know that we are very well endowed with groundwater, and we need to, we're in very good shape. But again, of all the water that we use, of that small percentage of that groundwater, 70% of it is used for agriculture, 22% is industrial processes, and 5% is used for cities and homes. Again, you will see different percentages from different groups, but again, it's this business of competing usages and how we're going to deal with those. So, if we look at competing demands and water scarcity, and we deal with this thing called the High Plains Aquifer. The High Plains Aquifer, as many of you know, extends from South Dakota down through Texas, and it covers parts of nine different states. The High Plains Aquifer is dominated by a geologic unit called the Ogallala Formation of the Ogallala Group, hence it's also called the Ogallala Aquifer. But as we look at the different colors on this slide, you will see that different places different places in the aquifer have been impacted differently by its water usage. Part of that has to do with the fact that, for example, up in Nebraska, this is data from a USGS, or this map is from the USGS report dated about 2014. This looks at changes in water levels from pre-development, prior to irrigation, to around 2013. You can see down in Texas and in Kansas and Oklahoma, you see places where the water has been drawn down of 150 feet. However, if we look up in Nebraska, we see places where there's actually been increases in water, indicated by those dark blue, relative to pre-development. And we'll look at these a little bit more closely later when we talk about Nebraska. But part of this has to do with the geology. Part of it has to do with that. In fact, the Ogallala Aquifer High Plains is located right at the surface here in Nebraska, down in Texas and other such places. It's at depth, and it's not recharged as fast. We're not adding water to it as quickly as we're taking it out. Hence these major drawdowns. You can see this graph, the graph over here in terms of depth to the water table. Back in the 30s to 50s, there was some irrigation, but not a lot. Then we had the major increases in irrigation occur, and we had rapid declines in water levels. So again, how we use the water, what rates we're using, takes a resource from being sustainable in terms of being able to last over time to being unsustainable and actually depleting it and resulting in groundwater overdrafts. So we got the business of competing demands. This is an interesting, this is Vegas in 1973. I know there's a couple people in here that enjoy going to Vegas. And this is 1973, and there we are in 2000. Now that's 15 years ago. If we look at the development of Vegas from 1922 to, actually this is from 1907. What's going on here? Okay, so we'll start it again here. We've had major expansions of an urban area into an environment where there's very little water to begin with. That obviously creates some real issues. When we start looking at drought and its impact in these dry areas, this is Lake Mead, which is just, what is it, south, predominantly east, I guess, south and east of Vegas. This is in 2000. This is after a little bit of a drought activity in 2004, and it's down roughly 18 meters, or about 55, 56 feet. All right. During this same time that we had major droughts, we had some competition going on for that water that not only was related to human consumption, but also to human recreation. And we had a whole series of golf courses going in that obviously you're putting golf courses in the middle of the desert. I'm not sure whether that's, and I used to be love golf, but is that really a good use of water resources in a desert environment? This afternoon, I found another slide by our friend Ken Dewey at the High Plains Climate Center. This is from July 11th, 2014, 10 years after that 2000. The water levels at Lake Mead are down now 147 feet. Another graphic I came across is that the Lake Mead is at 38% of its capacity. Lake Mead is a primary source of water for not only Vegas, but the agricultural commodities in California. So again, this business of competing demands and water scarcity, and how do we balance off the various usages. Here we are with this is one of the upstairs. They helped produce this the drought monitor map of the United States, and we've heard lots about the drought in California and its impact that it's having out there, and that they've over the last several years have invoked some very harsh, I don't want to say harsh restrictions, but they've implemented restrictions in terms of water usage because of this long-term drought. However, if we go back to 2013, this is in January of 2013, you can, as most of you experienced this 2013 drought and the major impacts that it has. And again, this impacts agriculture, it impacts wildlife, it impacts urban populations in terms of how it is that we're going to manage this resource, where we're balancing the inputs and the outputs. This is from the Drought Impact Reporter put out by the High Plains, the Drought Mitigation Center up here at UNL. And you can see, again, the competing usages and the impacts that the drought has had on water supply, tourism and recreation, plants and wildlife. So again, these competing usages have to be thought of, considered as we're dealing with this business of water. Now, the whole business of ownership, and we're going to see if we can do this little slide set that I've got here. I'm going to turn it over again to our friends, and I'm going to run it right off my screen here. But a little bit different perspective in terms of water at a variety of scales. When we started looking at water, safe water is a scarce resource on a global scale. 1 billion people do not have access to water. In fact, in 2003, the General Accounting Office talked about water shortages, not only within the United States, but also at a larger scale, and that when we look at by 2025, 1.8 billion people will live in water-stressed countries. Here's a map from Gleick from 1998, the guy that kind of opened up that video that we just saw. And this is just a map showing the percentage of population without access to safe drinking water. Clearly, this is an issue that's not is a problem on a global scale. This is not something that we deal with necessarily in the United States, certainly as much as, for example, in Central Africa. And we also have the business that might even be worse, is the fact that we've got 2.4 billion people that do not have access to sanitation facilities. So when raw sewage is going into streams and rivers, and then other people are drinking those waters, that can be a problem. Again, not so much of a problem for us in the United States, but certainly a problem on a global scale. And these I consider to be not so fun facts to know and tell. We've got this business of 3 million people dying prematurely from waterborne diseases, and 400,000 children die annually under the age of 5 from diarrhea, just in India alone. So where we have this business of unsafe water, basically lack of safe water killing more children than AIDS, malaria, and measles combined. Clearly, this is an issue. Again, does it impact us directly here in the United States? Again, it depends on how it is that you look at it, and again, what our responsibilities are on a global scale for assisting other countries and other societies with this sort of issue. We have water quality issues. This is actually an image from the Danube. There was a leak from an aluminum processing plant, I believe, or it's an aluminum ore processing plant in 2010, and it turned the Danube red. Well, the Danube is a major water supply for many countries in Europe. It also happens to be a major tour route for these boats and stuff that people take. So again, another issue related to water quality. So that's on a global scale. And again, my main point of this talk is predominantly kind of just introducing some large-scale sorts of issues and things that we need to be thinking about, again, not only individually, but as a country and also globally. But again, when I ask my classes, where does their water come from, oftentimes I'll get, well, it comes from the faucet. Or I'll hear the automatic thing, it comes from the Oglala Aquifer. But they don't necessarily know the fact that Lincoln's water supply comes from 26 miles away. Or what happens to that water between where it comes out of the aquifer near Ashland until it gets here in Lincoln. So again, this business of water literacy and knowing something about your own water supply is an important thing to know about. We've got all of these various headlines. This is recently from the journal Star on talking about new rules for the agriculture community related to keeping water clean. We have Governor Branstad over in Iowa talking about not only education, but water being a key issue for their state. And then we have these reports that come out. This is from 2014 of the journal Star, talking about Nebraska waterways being 6th worst in the nation for pollution. Those are a little bit disconcerting. And then we have more headlines. We've all heard about the business of fracking, and how does that impact our water supplies? And again, it depends upon where you are. Some of these things, this fracking business has been going on for decades. Okay, they've been going on for decades, but again, important issue related to water. And then, of course, we've heard about the crisis in Flint, Michigan, with regards to lead. And this brings up a whole other area of the business of infrastructure. not only where do we get the water, how do we move the water from where it's at in the Platte River to here in Nebraska, and how do we distribute it to our the constituents, the people that are going to be using it, and then how is those water supplies impacted by wastewater. So again, coming back to this business of this Ogallala Aquifer, the High Plains Aquifer here, it's one of many aquifers in the United States. This blue area on the map. And again, the High Plains Aquifer, this is showing, if you will, the saturated thickness. And when I talk about that, the thing that is a little disturbing sometimes when they show the area of thicknesses in a blue, it kind of reminds you of it might be like a swimming pool. It's not open water. We don't dig down to it and go swimming, okay? It's in and amongst the geologic material. And when we're talking about saturated thicknesses here in Nebraska, we've got over at least 1,500 feet of saturated thickness out in the sandhills. But down here in Texas, where we have these depletion problems, it may be on the order of 100 feet. You draw down 100 feet, if you've taken 75 feet out of 100 feet, that's a pretty huge reduction, a major reduction. So different parts of the High Plains Aquifer respond differently to the hydrologic conditions under which it is at. It's not all the same. It cannot necessarily be all governed the same way, I guess you could say, or managed the same way. It's different. Many of you have seen this saturated thickness map. Again, the business that we are very well endowed with groundwater here in Nebraska. This map shows, it says 500 feet. I was out on first time when I came to the Conservation Survey Division, I was out on the hole that went 1,805 feet to the base of the aquifer. So we have over 1,800 feet of saturated, well, at least at that particular, probably 1,700 feet of saturated material where we were. That's a lot of groundwater. Fortunately, that groundwater is out in the middle of Hooker and Grant counties, and there's not a lot of people that live out there. But again, it's there, and there's talk about transporting water to Denver and other such things. Interesting sorts of policy decisions that have to be made with regards to that. Should we be selling water as a commodity? I don't know. We have groundwater level changes. Here's some changes. We talk about this business of pre-development. That again, before irrigation to the spring of 2015. Red areas indicate places where there's been declines of 50 to 60 feet. The blue areas actually indicate places where the water levels have risen. The other thing you need to think about is, 50 feet sounds like a lot, but is that 50 feet out of 1,000 feet of aquifer thickness? Is it 50 feet out of 200 feet? Turns out in this area, it's somewhere between 250 and 300 feet or so. Is that if it's water being used beneficially, can we accept those sorts of declines in our system? Again, these are questions that have to be answered in terms of the resource. Here's the Lincoln public water supply over here by Ashland, and we pump water, gets moved 26 some odd miles from Ashland to Lincoln, and then it's distributed throughout the city. The water supply comes from alluvial aquifers. It comes from the sands and gravels that we see in the sandbars of the Platte River Valley. Oh, another little plug. I mean, there is data and information we should all be familiar with. So we're speaking from facts and knowledge. And again, these groundwater monitoring reports come out periodically. The latest one is in 2015 that talks about groundwater levels in Nebraska. There's also information available from the Department of Natural Resources on a state scale. We also have these natural resource districts throughout the state that have responsibility predominantly for groundwater sorts of things, but they have to put together groundwater management plans. To what extent do we know about what the groundwater management plan is in our area? And what are the triggers that trigger off action for the natural resources districts to do something? Another thing is that any water supply that supplies more than 25 people as part of their system is required to have some sort of data collection on water quality. Lincoln comes out with an annual drinking water quality report that's available on its website. Omaha and Lincoln have nice websites. Not all communities have this, but it's public information that can be accessed by the community. Interestingly, this is some water use trends in Lincoln, which kind of mirror the trends on a national scale. Is that Lincoln's population has risen to, about 275,000 people over the last, on this map, about 40 years. But our overall per capita usage of water has gone down. Those are good things. But again, we have lots of water that's being used for, irrigating grass and yards. I mean, is that a beneficial and a good use of water? Again, these are questions that have to be addressed. The business of the water infrastructure in Flint, Michigan is kind of the poster child now for infrastructure issues. If you look at this table here, this figure 4, here are the different sorts of pipe materials that have been used over time from the 1900s to the 2000s in terms of distributing water around communities. You will see that there are these, where they put these pipes together in different ways. Lead was used. Lead was used in Lincoln. It's there. Now, it just turns out that in Flint, they changed the water chemistry by going through a different source, and that has created some problems for them. It's activated, it's released lead into it. But we have similar sorts of piping here in Lincoln. When we start looking at that, in terms of on a national scale, we're changing the infrastructure or modifying or improving the infrastructure. If you look at these costs, this scale over here is in millions of dollars. So if you're looking at projecting out into the 2035 to 2060 range in terms of years, we're talking somewhere on the order of 25 to 30 billion dollars to replace the infrastructure to keep it functioning. There are some communities in the country that are losing upwards of 50% of their water. It's going someplace. They don't necessarily know where it's going. It's leaking someplace, but they don't necessarily know where it's going. So we're pumping, you're using money to pump water out of the ground, and then it's not even getting used where it needs to be used. These are issues that have to be dealt with. Then we've got this whole business of, in terms of understanding the water cycle and what it looks like. There are people in this room that have spent their careers looking at this sort of thing. And that water does enter into a groundwater system, and it can be in there it might be in there for years, it might be in there for thousands of years, depending upon how it moves through the geologic materials from where it recharges into the aquifer to where it discharges and it naturally discharges rivers, lakes, streams, and such places. But it's also removed by human activity, which can impact. Because humans are part of the system. We demand water from that system in varying locations. Some of the Platte River sorts of activities that go on, for example, the Lincoln Public Water Supply is removing water from the aquifer in the sands and gravels below the river, below the flowing water, but it also then, at some point in time, if it's pumped hard enough, it'll actually start reducing flow in the river. That has an impact on the wildlife and other natural demands from the system. So again, how do we manage all of these various usages? This is a diagram that shows, again, how is our water used? How is our water used in Lincoln? How is our water used on a national scale? These are national scale data put together by the USGS from 1950 to 2010 on 5-year intervals. A good thing is that our total withdrawal in terms of our total water uses have actually declined since about 1975 to present. We can see that the dominant use of the water, interestingly enough, is thermoelectric power for cooling electrical systems or power plants. So when we turn on the lights, it's actually having an impact on our water system someplace else because we're having to generate the electricity. If you notice that the irrigation use has actually gone down, not a lot is, but we have had an increase in general, although a little bit of a flattening out in terms of public water supply use. In Nebraska, that's actually, or excuse me, in Lincoln, that's actually gone down. So again, what is our water being used for, and how do we manage all of these various demands? Then we've got this whole thing of what we call hidden water or embedded water. And you can actually, people have gone to the degree of creating a way in which you can calculate your water footprint. And you can be looking at the total amount of fresh water that you use related to not only your drinking on a daily basis, but also how fresh water is used to produce goods and services that we use individually and we use as businesses, okay? If we look at some examples of this business of embedded water and how much fresh water is used, to grow a pound of cotton requires 2,000 gallons. An interesting thing here is that for every passenger car that's made, it's somewhere around 39,000 gallons go into the making of a vehicle. So again, as I taught, this business of water connecting everything to everything else, this is another prime example of how that works. To grow and feed, we are in Nebraska here we do a lot of cattle production. To produce a full-grown cow requires a lot of water, not only for the cows to drink, but for the food that's required for the cows to eat. So again, how do we deal with all these various demands? And how do we prioritize all these various demands? So again, if you go into a Google search and type water footprint, you go to one of these calculators and you can give an example of how water is used and how much water you personally use. I've had students do a little activity where they have to measure water over a 24-hour period, and it's always fascinating. A lot of them avoid using water for that 24-hour period, so they don't have to measure it, interestingly enough. But it's also interesting to see how much they actually use if they let themselves do it. And one young lady came in, and she had this ridiculous amount over a 24-hour period, like 500 gallons of water she used. Well, it turns out that she was taking hour-long showers. Turns out she wasn't paying for the water. Interestingly enough, she was using the showers at the athletic facility because she was an athlete and she liked hot showers. So she'd take about an hour-long shower after every practice, interestingly enough. So again, understanding what water is and how these all connections are, I think hopefully after she took my class, she reduced the time that she was taking those hot showers down to, half hour maybe. Would have been nice. But in any case, so we all have a challenge ahead of us in terms of what it is that we can do personally as well as societally. And one of the things we can do is reuse, reduce, and recycle water. In New Mexico, for example, in places that are up in the mountains where they don't have lots of water, they are using gray water. They use water that comes off of, let's say, washing dishes, off of washing your clothes and stuff, and reusing that, what they could refer to as gray water. One of the gentlemen that used to work here at the university actually has a 1,200-gallon cistern in his backyard here in Lincoln, where he's set up his house where he can reuse that water. So we're not using pure water, or we invest a lot of money in cleaning up our water, making sure that it's pure enough to drink, and then we use it for, say, watering the lawn, laundry, other things where we don't necessarily need. So again, how do we incorporate that sort of thing into our planning sort of system? How do we incorporate new plumbing systems? How do we develop new plumbing systems so that we don't necessarily have to be using the water that's drinking quality per se? There's also the business, again, of indirectly in terms of how we use water in terms of the products in which we buy. This is just an example from paper. Paper uses 7,000 gallons of water to create, I don't know how much but when we use something, it has a connection to something else. And in this particular case, we're connecting to water. So if we reduce the amount of paper we use or other materials that we use, how does that potentially save us water in the long term? So again, what can you do? You know, as we think about solutions and the challenges that we have to water, we need to be thinking about it holistically, not only from the environmental standpoint, but clearly all of these decisions involve an economic component, and all of these things impact society in terms of how we are going to use our water, and is water a fundamental right to everybody like breathing the air? It's an interesting question. And if people end up being charged lots and lots for water, how does that impact people that may be on a lower socioeconomic level, as an example? So again, getting back to my 4 messages, the idea here today was to help increase your water literacy and to at least give a better, maybe a larger scale of understanding of where water kind of fits into the big scheme of things. And I think that it's really important that we know individually where our water comes from and how we're using it, and be very cognizant of those sorts of things. The video clips, particularly with regards to that flow movie, is that many people have many different perspectives about water issues. And hopefully we can find some common ground, we can do it respectfully, and we can also hopefully agree to disagree to some extent in order to come to some sort of solutions to these issues. Today, I've been kind of focusing more on the science and natural environment sorts of things, and kind of delving into some of the economic and political aspects, but we need to deal with them all together. Hopefully, you've seen that water does connect everything to everything else, and that we may use our water here, but it may be having an impact on something someplace else. And it may not be tomorrow, and it may not be the next day. It might be years from now, but we may have potential impact on things. So again, we need to consciously think about how we are using our resources. And the whole business of, again, thinking about sustainably using our water resources. So we're managing the water so that we're not using our reservoirs where that water is stored, so that we're tapping into our, if you will, our bank accounts or our water accounts and depleting those for people in the future. We really need to be thinking about the balance in terms of what nature gives us and how fast we're using it, and that there'll be a balance there. So again, hopefully, learning makes the journey fun, so I'm glad that you're able to come here and hopefully take away a few things. But as you consider water, what impacts does water have on me? I think that we all have some feeling for that. How do I impact water? And what positive contributions can I make to these water issues? And with that, thank you for listening. And I guess at this stage, my understanding of the process here is I'm going to take questions from the group here in Lincoln, and then we will open it to questions from the other venues, if there are any questions. Or corrections. There's a lot of expertise in this audience in front of me, it turns out, so I'm a little bit scared of what they're going to say. Anyway, yes?
I have a question, and then I want to make a comment.
Okay.
My question to you is, what keeps you awake at night in terms of sustainability of water? Is there any one thing? And it's somewhat rhetorical, because I want to keep things moving, but here's my concern. California's lack of water, pick another region, and here we are in Nebraska with a resource that's rich in we have an asset that's rich with water. We have only 1.9 million people. Obviously, we have the food supply that is going to be integral in the years to come as to what happens to that water supply. Do we use it to grow food for the world? My concern is California, or whichever other region you want to say that has this need for water. At what point does the federal government come in and say the water that's in Nebraska goes to the more heavily populated area? And what we do now in anticipation of that is kind of way out there, because I get some frowns when I voice this, but Doc, that's what I guess I'm thinking of is what happens when we get to that point, if we get to that point.
Well, I can say that that's beyond my I guess level of expertise in terms of the politics and the policies that would go behind it. I mean, I'm a geologist by training, so the fact is that we go out and we mine metals and we sell metals. Do we treat water in the same way? Do we take this vast, reservoir of water that we have in the Sandhills as an example, and do we sell it like a commodity? The fundamental difference between metals and water is that water is something that we require to live, but not only we require to live, but most, living organisms require. So, again, if we get into the business of buying and selling water as a mechanism for dealing with this, you start going down some really interesting slopes.
My point exactly. So what sustains Wyoming, and what has sustained North Dakota? Wyoming coal, North Dakota oil, and how are their states able to eliminate the wild property tax situation we have in Nebraska with some of this stuff? And our natural resource is water. And there's a gentleman as far back as 1970 that said what you just said is maybe water is a resource that is sold like a commodity.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't think it's that far out, actually. I think it's far out there, but I don't think it's even more than that.
Our showers. I mean, this is a tremendous group that you have. I don't want to go on and on, but the things that we do in our everyday lives that we just take for granted, brushing one's teeth and getting that water, whatever example one wants. Thanks. That's all.
No, and I appreciate it. You asked me what keeps me up at night with regards to water. I'm a kind of an optimist, and so things will kind of work their way out because of some of these economic things, because people will be thinking about doing them. And again, I don't know how it's all going to play. But as you've indicated, it's a very complicated sort of thing with some very interesting ethical and value-related questions that are certainly not something I'm able to address certainly on a national scale.
Thanks for your presentation.
You bet. Other questions? Yeah, Brittany?
So kind of along those same lines, when we're compared to California, where they're obviously feeling that urgency and they're experiencing it right now. In Nebraska, I know I've run into it and I've worked for the school district. So coming from that perspective of trying to create urgency with waste management, we obviously have a lot of space in our landfill. And so when you talk about that, there's not that sense of urgency. Or energy. Our energy costs are crazy low in Nebraska and in Lincoln specifically. So creating that urgency of why do I need to conserve this when the costs are so low compared to the rest of the country. So what are your thoughts? What do you recommend for creating that sense of urgency here in Lincoln when we do have such a rich resource and we don't want to just use it in a frivolous way because it won't maintain?
Well, in terms of we talk about the low cost energy. Water is ridiculously low cost too, relative to other places in the country. So that obviously plays a role. And I think part of the answer comes down to that as individuals, we need to be thinking about this at a little bit larger scale. As I mentioned here, we need to look at it more in a systems sort of way, in that, yeah, we want to be concerned about the water that we have right now, but we also have to be thinking about into the future and what is it that we're going to do now to help protect that resource into the future. And I think that becomes it becomes somewhat of an educational sort of thing in terms of trying to help not only people in this room, but also the kids in the classroom to be thinking a little bit more on the global standpoint, and the things that we do here may not seem like it's an impact right now. We've got plenty of water, but it does have some implications down the road. So it's looking at people's values and how we, value these sorts of commodities and what obligations we feel that we have towards the future, towards the children that are in the classroom, towards other people in the country in terms of other, what they're doing with their water and how their resources are managed. Does that?
Yeah, I know it's a.
Did I script the question well enough for you, Brittany? Is that?
It's a tricky subject.
Yeah.
But yeah, just you mentioned water literacy, and that just touches on the larger environmental literacy and what we're teaching our children and having them appreciate that and have that be a value growing up. So how do you create that value, I guess? And that, I think the education is part of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is, and it's not just a class. It's something that's embedded throughout, that they're seeing this, and let's just call it a systems approach, or how these things are connected, not only with regards to water, but how energy impacts water, how what we buy, all the technologies and stuff that we have available to us and how that impacts things, and start looking at those connections, but seeing those connections consistently all the way through until they're thinking more holistically, or not until, they will be thinking holistically if they're getting that sort of an approach all the way along. Other questions? Yeah, Mark?
Well, there's things about water that might not keep me up tonight, they might get me up. But the point that you touched on, that I think we ought to look in a little more detail is the use of water, because you showed the large demand for the production of electricity. But that's really not actually a consumptive use, if you will. So I think we need to kind of categorize how we use the water and make it available to reuse.
Yeah. And that's in the earlier slides where we are dealing with the 70% for irrigation and 20% for industrial and 10%. That's kind of taking that thermal electric power out. Now, oftentimes that water is used to cool and then it's put back into the system, but then that water is altered. So definitely, in terms of a consumptive use, in terms of actually taking it from one part of the cycle and moving it completely out of the cycle to someplace else, you're exactly right. That thermoelectric power doesn't fit that. But we're getting back to these other usages on this diagram. For example, the business of irrigation and public supply, and how we use water is really extremely important. When how we irrigate, how we've all driven down Interstate 80, and you see water it's 95 degrees out, and you see the water being sprinkled out. I mean, there's quite a bit of it that's being evaporated and moving to someplace else. I know that there's lots of other technologies that are being used on, and then we've definitely improved our irrigation water use, but that's just one place. There's lots of other places where we really need to be looking at how water is used and reused, most definitely. Other questions here? Otherwise, we can open it up to the masses, I guess, that are in the other. So, do I stop sharing? Is that what I do here?
No, you can keep sharing. Okay, that's fine. So I just want to remind everyone that we still have a couple minutes left. You can enter your questions via chat or send them to your room host, and they'll give them to me. Or you can use the hashtag SLPSThursday for Twitter. I just have a comment that was made. Somebody said, I like what he said about thinking about now and the future. He phrased that important concept well. And then I have a couple questions here. Do you have any recommendations on a resource that would show drinking water quality across Nebraska and Iowa, or across the U.S.?
It's a good question. I mean, the U.S. Geological Survey has information. Environmental Protection Agency has information from all the public water supplies and things. If you're looking for maps and other things, again, EPA, USGS come out with those sorts of things. Folks in the audience here, do you have anything else jump into your mind, Jim, in terms of water quality? Maps and stuff, but I mean, those are the primary. And then every individual states have their. We also have the state geological surveys and state natural resources places where you can get various types of maps as well.
Dave, I think maybe the American Water Works Association might have some information with regard to quantity consumption in Nebraska, Iowa, and elsewhere.
The comment was made with regards to the American Water Works Association. And in fact, some of the slides that I showed with regards to the business of infrastructure came from one of their publications. But they also have some information.
Okay, so another question we have is, what effect do you foresee bottled water having on our water supply? Any ideas on what can be done?
Well, it's interesting that in that little clip from the movie Flow, they're referring to Nestle using water in Pennsylvania during a time of drought, and water levels were dropping, and I think there was the water that they were pumping out was having an impact on local domestic wells, individual wells, as well as public water supply wells. So again, it's the nature of the resource in terms of what it is that's available, and are you using it faster than it can be replaced. The other thing that's interesting about water, the bottled water industry, is the fact that it is not regulated like your public water supply is. Public water supply is required to report in terms of, I don't know what the laundry list is, but it's in the hundreds of contaminants that they're required to test for. And water that ends up in a bottled water is not necessarily under those same under that same sort of scrutiny. And so that to me is an issue. But again, it comes down to this whole business of people understanding how water is used and where it comes from, and is your public water supply water better? Is it different qualities? Again, I don't know how it created such a demand for water in plastic bottles that turning the tide on that is going to take a change of values and change of mentality in how we look at water. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where I will end my answer, I guess.
Okay. Although domestic use in Nebraska is lower compared to other uses, what are your thoughts on the reuse of water in domestic household cases, such as black gray water reuse?
Well, interestingly, when I was growing up, and I grew up in Minnesota, the land of 15,000 lakes, as the case may be, but when I was growing up, we used gray water they actually had washing machines that you would wash your clothes. The water would be pumped into a basin, and you'd rinse the clothes with clear water and then pump the water back in. So you were actually reusing the gray water. That didn't require a replumbing of the entire house. I think that it would be a good idea for communities to be thinking about ways in which, and maybe it's not just simple changes in plumbing codes and other such things, in order to allow for gray water to be used and to design your houses to be able to do that. I think it'd be a great idea. There'd be some additional expense, I think, potentially involved in it. Again, depending upon how it is that you plumb your system. And I'm not a plumber, so I'm sure that there are ways in which things could be done in order to use that, to be able to reuse that water again in a non-drinking sort of way.
Okay, great. Let's see. Besides reducing the amount of water we use, what else can we do to combat water scarcity? Would rain catchment be beneficial, especially in small communities when it comes to farming?
This gets, well, there's a variety of boundaries that you start walking over with regards to say catchment of water. So for example, I think it's in Colorado and it may be in New Mexico, and people in the audience here can correct me if I'm wrong, but there, here in Nebraska, you can have rain barrels off your house and you can capture that water. In other places, in other parts of the country, that's illegal because you're actually taking away water that has been promised to somebody else by them buying a water right. So a lot of the stuff would be governed by local or state level water policy. In terms of agriculture, I mean, there's been a lot of work. There's been a tremendous amount of work done in terms of how to keep water on the landscape so that it doesn't run off, and that you can actually maximize the use of the water that's falling on the landscape. I mean, those are certainly ways in which we can reduce reduce usage, and actually maybe even enhance water or groundwater recharge in some cases. There was a design of some recharge air, kind of artificial recharge in the York region at one point in time. I'm not sure what the status of that is, but some of those sorts of things have been looked at in terms of capturing it and then trying to confine it so that it can go back down and recharge the groundwater system. Again, whenever you start messing with Mother Nature, it creates another problem someplace else potentially. So again, one needs to understand the system and the dynamics before proposing, because it might work in some places and it may not work in others. So one size fits all is not going to work.
I agree. So I just want to let everyone know that we still have time for a couple more questions. So if you want to send them to me via chat or Twitter, #SLPSThursday, or send them to your room host and they'll get them to me. All right, so the next question is, what is a gallon of water worth in India?
Better Google that, because I don't know what the answer to that question is.
That was a tough one. Okay, the next one, is there a particular product or food that uses a surprising amount of water that we should avoid?
Well, actually, I'm always surprised that when I see on that one table that I showed with regards to the amount of water that is used to create beef. It's a lot of water, because it's not only the water that the cow is consuming, but it's all of the grains and everything else that go into it. And it is really quite a large amount of water. Things like cotton is another commodity that uses lots of water. And again, sometimes we're growing things in environments that they weren't necessarily that they didn't necessarily evolve to be in, and so you're using, for example, the golf courses in Arizona, where you've got grass growing in a desert environment, and grass needs, let's just say it needs 9 inches, but you're only getting 4 inches a year natural rainfall. That's a problem. So again, those would be my two examples. Would be the beef and cotton as examples.
Okay, next question is, globally and or nationally, what is the #1 use or waste of fresh water?
Well, the #1 use, according, again, if you concern yourself with the electrical supply usage, but it's irrigation is agricultural irrigation is the largest use of water. Now, getting to the question of wasting water, that's a whole nother question in terms of how it is that you want to define waste. Irrigation, agricultural irrigation, not only in the United States but on a global scale, agricultural irrigation is the most significant usage of water. So that's my answer.
Okay, do you think there's a certain stigma around water where people think of any lightly used or old water as dirty? And if so, how can we change this stigma?
Oh, yeah, there's absolutely a stigma of it. I mean, just think about, again, going back to my example of how we washed clothes back in the 70s, so to speak, in using the gray water. There were people at that time that thought, well, your clothes aren't getting as clean. Got some background in chemistry, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. How you change that that stigma, if you will, or change that mentality, again, is through the business of educating and having some very explicit examples for how, in this particular case, gray water usage and clothes cleanliness, they're not necessarily impacted, or they're not impacted to the point where it's going to stop you from doing it. And again, it's an education thing, and it's kind of changing your mindset through seeing some information or data. At least that'd be the way. That'd be a place to start anyway.
Okay, let's see. If you could wave a magic wand, what 3 changes would you focus on?
What if I could wave a magic wand? What 3 changes would I? Well, one of the things I guess I would look at is the business of in terms of urban supplies. Again, is the business of the use of turf grass and using of. I mean, I'm not against grass per se, but when you're planting grass such as bluegrass, which uses lots of water and it wasn't designed for this sort of environment, maybe we could, talk about using some other type of grass if you're really into the grass thing, or, going to natural plants and things would be, I mean, you see this in Arizona, they've done that. I mean, around every house, there's no grass, it's rock. I'm a geologist, I like rock, so that's a good thing. So that would be one piece. Maybe it's the whole idea of thinking about changing what we eat. Again, having a diet that's dominated by meat products, that may not be. There may be other ways in order to get that same nourishment that may not use as much water. But again, that would be a second thing. I guess I'm not sure if I necessarily. I mean, I like meat, so I don't know if I would necessarily advocate, but that would be a way. And then the third one, I guess my third one really is not necessarily a specific thing, but it really would be making people more, and getting back to a question I was asked here about the business of education, just people valuing the resource more. If I could, that would be the number one thing, is getting people to value the resource more and understand the implications for when we use it in one place, that it does have implications other places. So that would be my 3 things.
Okay. Let's see. A question from Columbus. I know that in some of the small towns around here, people can't drink their tap water because of nitrates. Wondering how common is this, and why isn't this being treated like an emergency, similar to the Flint crisis?
Well, my answer, I would defer to the Department of Health and Human Services, because they're the ones that are responsible for that. There are places throughout Nebraska that have had to close down wells because of high nitrates, as well as naturally occurring things like arsenic and naturally occurring things like uranium that exist in the groundwater supply. Could you remind me what the question was again? Because I just want to make sure that I address it. Could you rephrase it, please, or restate it?
Yes. The person said, I know that in some of the small towns around here, so Columbus, people can't drink their tap water because of nitrates. Wondering how common is this, and why isn't this being treated like an emergency, similar to the Flint crisis?
like I said, the State Department of Health does regulate those sorts of things. They will turn off wells if they stay above for nitrate nitrogen, it's 10 parts per million. If it stays above that for, a certain number of tests, oftentimes communities do have, multiple wells. I don't know exactly why it's not. It could be the size and the magnitude of the Flint, Michigan case, and the fact that the media got a hold of it, and Flint is not necessarily a unique community in terms of this being an issue. Okay, so I don't know why it's not. The sense of urgency isn't there like it is in Flint for those communities. I'm sure those communities are a little bit concerned and have a high level of anxiety potentially about it. But oftentimes those communities are working with the Department of Health and Human Resources to solve the problem in some way. So that's the end of my answer.
Okay, we have a comment that came in. It says, grass-fed cattle are less water intensive and were not considered in feedlot cattle stats, as I understand the stats compilation.
Could very well be.
Okay, and then I just want to ask, is there any more questions there in Lincoln that maybe came up?
They're all shaking their head no, or they're still ready. So that's good.
Okay, we just have 2 more questions in. I just want to say if anybody else has any more questions, please get them in. I'm going to do a last call for questions. Okay, so do you think desalination will be an option for supplying water in the future?
I mean, it's already occurring. In San Diego, they put in a big desalination plant already. It's just a matter. And then I think also in some Middle East countries and stuff that they're also doing desalination. It's certainly an option. It's an expensive option, and then that gets into the whole business of the economics, and then also the equity business, and the people having access to the water that they need without having to pay exorbitant prices for it. The technology's there, and people are using it. Again, it's what people are willing to pay to do it.
All right, and then I have a final question here. What areas do you find people are most illiterate on in regards to water or water use?
I would say their own water supply. I will ask, in my classes, I'll ask students to draw their version of the water cycle, and the water cycle that they typically draw is a global water cycle. So they get this water cycle on a global scale. Asking them what the water cycle is that's impacting their own local water supply, that's a whole nother, like I said, the majority of people that are in my classes don't know in Lincoln where their water comes from. Now, they may not be from Lincoln, but I think that, a good idea would be if they're from someplace else, they should find out where their water's coming from. They rely on it on a daily basis. So I think just people knowing about their own water supply and understanding what goes into their water supply would be something very useful for everybody to know. We start off at the small scale, then you can expand to a larger scale, if you will.
Okay, well, that's all the questions I have here. I'd just like to say a closing real quick. Thank you, Dr. Gosselin, for that very informative presentation and your great work on educating individuals on this important issue. I'd also like to thank the UNL Environmental Studies program for hosting. Today's live viewership was approximately 51, and that's not including the UNL site. So thank you to our SLPS partners for a wonderful year, and to all our viewers for joining us today and for our past presentations. We've had 6 excellent presentations this year covering the Living Building Challenge, Sustainability in Business, Nebraska's Recycling Study, Aquaponics, Walking and Biking, and Water Conservation. All of our past presentations are currently available for viewing on our site at www.cccneb.edu/SLPS, and today's presentation will be up shortly. I have thoroughly enjoyed all the presentations and coordinating with all our partners and speakers to get these important presentations out to the public. The Sustainability Leadership Presentation Series has grown so much over the past years, and it is my hope that it will continue to grow. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall for the return of the SLPS.